In the shadows of Buckingham Palace, where every whisper carries the weight of 1,000 secrets, one man's duty would become his burden. What happens when loyalty to the crown collides with the most private moments of those who wear it? Sometimes the greatest revelations come not from what we seek to discover, but from what we accidentally witness. This is the story of a royal guard who saw too much, heard too much, and whose silence would be tested in ways he never imagined. The marble corridors of the palace have witnessed centuries of drama, but nothing could prepare Sergeant James Mitchell for what he would stumble upon during what should have been a routine security check. In a world where privacy is a luxury even royalty cannot always afford, one moment would change everything, not just for a dedicated guard, but for the very people he had sworn to protect. The morning mist clung to the windows of Buckingham Palace like ghostly fingers, creating an ethereal atmosphere that Sergeant James Mitchell had grown accustomed to during his 12 years of service. At 42, James possessed the kind of steady demeanor that made him perfect for royal protection duty. His brown eyes missed nothing, his posture remained impeccable even during the longest shifts, and his reputation for discretion was legendary among his colleagues. James had joined the Royal Protection Unit straight from the military, drawn by a sense of duty that ran deeper than mere employment. He genuinely believed in serving the crown, not just as an institution, but as a symbol of continuity and tradition that bound the nation together. His colleagues often joked that James took his oath more seriously than some members of the royal family took theirs, but he never minded the teasing. To him, every day spent protecting the monarchy was a day spent serving something greater than himself. The palace was unusually quiet that Tuesday morning in October. Most of the senior royals were engaged in their individual schedules, and the usual bustle of staff members preparing for public engagements was notably absent. James appreciated these calmer moments, as they allowed him to focus on the more routine but equally important aspects of security. Checking locks, reviewing camera footage, and ensuring that every entrance and exit remained properly monitored. His radio crackled softly as he made his way through the East Wing corridor. "Mitchell, this is Control. We need you to conduct a routine sweep of the blue drawing room area. There was some concerns about a window latch reported by housekeeping this morning." James acknowledged the request with his characteristic efficiency. "Copy that, Control. En route to blue drawing room now." He adjusted his earpiece and quickened his pace slightly, his polished shoes making barely a whisper against the ornate carpeting that lined the palace floors. The blue drawing room was one of the palace's most elegant spaces, featuring silk-covered walls in a distinctive blue damask pattern and housing some of the royal collection's most precious artwork. James had always found it peaceful, a place where history seemed to breathe through every carefully preserved detail. As he approached the room, he noticed that the heavy oak door was slightly ajar, which was unusual given the strict protocols about securing all rooms when not in active use. James paused, his training automatically kicking in. Protocol dictated that he should announce his presence, but something about the situation felt delicate. He could hear voices from within the room. Voices he recognized immediately. His pulse quickened as he realized that King Charles and Queen Camilla were inside, apparently engaged in what sounded like a private conversation. Professional instinct warred with personal discretion as James found himself frozen in the corridor. His duty required him to complete the security check, but his respect for the royal family's privacy suggested he should retreat and return later. The conversation inside seemed intense, though he couldn't make out specific words from his position in the hallway. James decided to wait, hoping the conversation would conclude quickly, so he could complete his assigned task without intrusion. He positioned himself where he could monitor the corridor while remaining respectfully distant from the door. However, as minutes passed, it became clear that whatever was being discussed was far from a casual chat. The sound of a chair being moved abruptly caught his attention, followed by what sounded like papers being shuffled with considerable force. James felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the unmistakable tension that accompanies a serious disagreement. He had been around the royal family long enough to understand that they were, despite their public roles, human beings with human emotions and conflicts. "This cannot continue, Charles," came Queen Camilla's voice, clearer now and carrying a tone James had never heard from her before. There was a sharpness to her words that contrasted dramatically with her usual public composure. "The implications of what you're suggesting go far beyond just our family. Have you considered what this means for the institution itself?" James felt his face flush with embarrassment and concern. He knew he shouldn't be hearing this, yet his position made retreat nearly impossible without potentially being detected. He pressed himself against the wall, hoping to make himself invisible, while trying to decide on the most appropriate course of action. The king's response was muffled. But James could detect frustration in his tone. Whatever Charles was saying seemed to only intensify Camilla's concern, as her next words came through even more clearly. You've spent your entire life preparing for this role, and now you want to throw it all away for what? Pride? Some misguided sense of justice? There was a pause, and James could hear footsteps pacing across the room's hardwood floor. I won't stand by and watch you destroy everything we've worked to build. James felt as though he was trapped in a nightmare. Every instinct told him to leave immediately, to find some way to excuse himself from this situation. But practical concerns kept him frozen in place. His radio could crackle at any moment with another assignment, potentially exposing his location. The corridor offered no convenient alcoves or side passages where he could take cover. The conversation inside the room continued, with Charles apparently making some kind of impassioned argument that James couldn't quite follow. What he could understand was that this was no ordinary marital disagreement. The weight of their words, the references to the institution and implications, suggested they were grappling with something that could affect the monarchy itself. The Prime Minister will never support this, Camilla continued, her voice now carrying a note of desperation. The Archbishop's position is already precarious, and if you force his hand on this matter, you'll be asking him to choose between his faith and his loyalty to the crown. Is that really what you want your reign to be remembered for? James realized with growing horror that he was overhearing a constitutional crisis in the making. Whatever Charles was proposing apparently had implications for both the government and the Church of England. The gravity of the situation made James feel physically ill, not just because of his accidental intrusion into their privacy, but because of what it might mean for the country he had sworn to serve. The sound of the door handle turning sent a bolt of panic through James's entire body. He looked desperately up and down the corridor, but there was nowhere to hide. In a split-second decision that would haunt him for months to come, James pressed himself as flat as possible against the wall beside the door, hoping against hope that whoever emerged would turn in the opposite direction. Queen Camilla stepped out first, her face flushed and her usual composed demeanor notably absent. She paused in the doorway, looking back into the room with an expression that mixed anger, disappointment, and what James thought might be genuine fear. I need time to think about this, Charles, but I want you to know that what you're asking of me, of us, goes against everything I believe about duty and sacrifice. King Charles appeared in the doorway, his own face showing the strain of their conversation. Time is something we don't have much of, Camilla. The decision needs to be made, and it needs to be made soon. I've already waited too long to address this. James held his breath as both royals stood mere feet away from him, their attention completely absorbed by their conflict. He could see the tension in their postures, the way they held themselves with a rigidity that spoke of deep disagreement and personal pain. Then you'll have to make it without my blessing, Camilla replied, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind her words. I cannot and will not be party to something that I believe will damage the crown irrevocably. With that, she turned and walked directly past James, missing him by inches as he pressed himself against the wall. James watched in amazement as she continued down the corridor without once looking in his direction, her mind clearly occupied entirely by the conversation she had just concluded. King Charles remained in the doorway for several more moments, his gaze following his wife's retreating figure. James could see the conflict playing out across his features, determination warring with doubt, conviction battling with the loneliness of leadership. Finally, Charles stepped back into the room and closed the door firmly behind him. James remained frozen against the wall for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. His heart hammered in his chest as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. Whatever constitutional crisis was brewing, he now knew about it before most of the government, before the media, perhaps before anyone else outside the royal family itself. The weight of this knowledge felt crushing. James had always taken pride in his discretion, in his ability to fade into the background and allow the royals to live as normally as possible within the constraints of their positions. Now he possessed information that could potentially destabilize the government, information that he had no right to have and no idea how to handle. His radio crackled suddenly, making him jump. Mitchell, what's your status on that blue drawing room check? James cleared his throat, hoping his voice would sound normal. Control, the room appears to be occupied at the moment. I'll return to complete the check later. Copy that, Mitchell. Report to the south entrance when convenient. We have a delivery that needs security clearance. On my way, James replied, grateful for an excuse to leave the area. As he walked away from the blue drawing room, his mind raced with questions and concerns. What was Charles planning that Camilla found so objectionable? What role did the Prime Minister and the Archbishop play in whatever decision needed to be made? And most importantly, what was James supposed to do with this knowledge? The remainder of his shift passed in a blur of routine duties, performed with mechanical precision while his thoughts remained entirely focused on what he had overheard. James found himself studying every news report, every official statement, looking for clues about what might be developing behind the palace walls. But the public face of the monarchy remained as serene and unchanging as ever. As he prepared to end his shift that evening, James made a decision that would define the weeks to come. He would say nothing to anyone, not to his colleagues, not to his superiors, not even to his wife Sarah when she asked about his unusually quiet mood at dinner. The secret would remain locked inside him, a burden he would carry alone. But as James learned over the following days, some secrets have a way of becoming heavier rather than lighter with time. What he had witnessed was only the beginning of a crisis that would test not just the royal marriage, but the very foundations of the British constitutional system. And James Mitchell, who had spent his career protecting the royal family from external threats, now found himself in possession of information that could pose the greatest internal threat the monarchy had faced in generations. The irony was not lost on him that, in his attempt to protect their privacy, he had become the unwitting guardian of their most dangerous secret. The following days at Buckingham Palace carried an undercurrent of tension that James Mitchell felt like a constant electric charge in the air. He found himself analysing every interaction between the King and Queen Consort, searching for signs of the conflict he had accidentally witnessed. To the casual observer, Charles and Camilla maintained their usual public demeanour, but James noticed the subtle changes. The way they stood just slightly farther apart during official photographs, how their conversation seemed more formal and brief, and the absence of the small, affectionate gestures that had previously marked their relationship. 3 days after the overheard argument, James was assigned to security detail for a private meeting between the King and Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary. This was routine. James had overseen countless such meetings during his tenure. However, given what he now knew, even the most mundane royal business felt charged with potential significance. The meeting was scheduled for the King's private study, a room that Charles had personally redesigned upon ascending to the throne. Unlike the grand staterooms, this space reflected his personal tastes. Walls lined with books on architecture and sustainable farming, comfortable chairs arranged around a fireplace, and large windows overlooking the palace gardens. James had always appreciated the room's more human scale, which seemed to put visitors at ease. Sir Clive arrived precisely on time, as was his habit. James had worked with the private secretary on numerous occasions and found him to be a man of impeccable discretion and unwavering loyalty to the crown. At 63, Sir Clive possessed the kind of institutional knowledge that made him invaluable to any monarch. Having served in various capacities under 3 different monarchs throughout his career, James positioned himself outside the study, following standard protocol for private meetings. However, his recent experience had made him acutely aware of how easily conversations could be overheard, particularly when emotions ran high. He found himself unconsciously straining to catch any hint of what was being discussed, despite his professional training telling him to ignore whatever he might inadvertently hear. For the first 20 minutes, the meeting proceeded normally. James could hear the low murmur of conversation, the occasional rustle of papers, and the familiar sounds of tea being served. Sir Clive's voice carried its usual measured tone, while the King's responses seemed appropriately engaged but unremarkable. Then the tenor of the conversation changed dramatically. "Sir, with the greatest respect, I must strongly advise against this course of action." Sir Clive's voice carried through the door with unusual clarity, suggesting he had raised his volume considerably. The constitutional implications alone would create a crisis unlike anything we've seen since the abdication. James felt his blood run cold. The reference to the abdication, when King Edward VIII gave up the throne to Mary Wallace Simpson, suggested they were discussing something that could fundamentally alter the monarchy. His earlier eavesdropping had hinted at such implications, but hearing it confirmed by the King's most trusted advisor made the situation feel terrifyingly real. "I understand your concerns, Clive, but I've given this considerable thought," came Charles's response, his voice carrying the weight of deep conviction. "The situation has reached a point where maintaining the status quo would be a greater betrayal of my duties as king than taking the action I'm proposing." "But, sir, have you fully considered the impact on public confidence? The polls already show some erosion of support following recent events. If you proceed with this, particularly without the Queen Consort's support, it could destabilize not just the monarchy but the entire constitutional framework." James realized that his hands were trembling slightly. Whatever Charles was planning, it was significant enough to potentially shake the foundations of British government. The mention of polling data, suggested that the palace was already dealing with some level of public relations challenges, though James couldn't recall any major controversies in recent weeks. "The opinion polls are exactly why I need to act," Charles replied, his voice growing more animated. "The people deserve better than the compromises and half-truths that have characterized this issue for too long. My mother spent 70 years building trust with the British people. I won't betray that trust by continuing to avoid a difficult but necessary decision." Sir Clive's response came after a long pause, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of desperation that James had never heard from the usually composed private secretary. "Sir, I implore you to at least consult with the Prime Minister before making any final decision. The government has a right to know about actions that could affect constitutional stability. Moreover, they might be able to suggest alternatives that could achieve your goals without the risks inherent in your current plan." "The government's position is precisely the problem," Charles replied sharply. "Their inability to address this issue directly is what has forced my hand. I've waited for political leadership on this matter for months, and their continued inaction has made my intervention necessary." James found himself leaning slightly closer to the door, despite every professional instinct telling him to move away. The conversation had taken on the quality of a historical moment, the kind of discussion that would be analyzed by scholars for decades to come. Yet here he was, a working-class man from Yorkshire, who had never imagined he would become an accidental witness to constitutional history. "What about the Archbishop's position?" Sir Clive continued. "His Grace has made his views quite clear, and forcing him to choose between his religious convictions and his loyalty to the Crown would create an unprecedented crisis for the Church of England. The religious implications alone could split the Anglican community. The Archbishop's position is based on doctrine that no longer reflects the values of modern Britain," Charles responded, his voice carrying a tone of finality. "If the Church cannot evolve to meet the needs of contemporary society, then perhaps it's time to reconsider the relationship between Crown and Church." James felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. The king was apparently considering actions that could affect not just the monarchy, but the established Church as well. The complexity of what he was proposing seemed to extend into every aspect of British institutional life. "Sir, I must ask you to consider your legacy," Sir Clive said, his voice now carrying a pleading quality. "You've waited your entire life to become king. Your vision for a modernized monarchy, your environmental advocacy, your charitable work. All of this could be overshadowed by a single controversial decision. Is this issue truly worth risking everything you've worked to achieve?" There was a long silence before Charles responded, and when he did, his voice carried a weight of sadness that made James's heart ache for the man behind the crown.
"Clive, my entire life has been about duty. Duty to the Crown, duty to the Commonwealth, duty to traditions that stretch back 1,000 years.
But I've come to understand that true duty sometimes requires us to break with tradition when tradition no longer serves the greater good. And the Queen Consort's opposition doesn't give you pause?" "Camilla's opposition breaks my heart," Charles admitted, his voice barely audible through the door. "But I cannot let my personal relationships, however important they are to me, override my responsibilities to the nation. She'll come to understand eventually, I hope. But with or without her support, this decision needs to be made." James heard the sound of chairs being moved and realized the meeting was concluding. He quickly stepped away from the door, positioning himself at a more appropriate distance while trying to appear as though he had been casually monitoring the corridor, rather than inadvertently eavesdropping on what might be the most significant royal conversation in decades. Sir Clive emerged from the study looking considerably older than when he had entered an hour earlier. His usually perfect posture was slightly slumped, and his face carried the expression of a man who had just failed at something of vital importance. He nodded politely to James as he passed, but there was none of his usual pleasant small talk. The king appeared in the doorway shortly after, and James was struck by how the weight of leadership seemed to have settled even more heavily on his shoulders. Charles looked directly at James for a moment, and in that brief exchange, James wondered if somehow his knowledge of the situation was visible on his face. "Sergeant Mitchell," Charles said quietly, "I trust you understand the importance of discretion in all matters relating to palace business." "Of course, Your Majesty," James replied, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "Complete discretion is fundamental to my duties." Charles nodded, studying James's face for another moment before returning to his study and closing the door firmly behind him. That evening, James found himself unable to concentrate on anything at home. His wife Sarah noticed his distraction immediately, as she had during the previous few days, but her gentle inquiries about his mood were met with vague responses about work stress. James hated keeping secrets from Sarah. Their marriage had always been built on openness and trust, but he knew that sharing what he had learned would only burden her with the same impossible knowledge that was weighing on him. Over dinner, Sarah mentioned a news report she had seen about the king's upcoming state visit to France, wondering if James would be part of the security detail. Under normal circumstances, such an assignment would have excited James. Foreign visits were among the most interesting aspects of his job, but now he found himself wondering what other conversations he might accidentally overhear, what other secrets he might unwillingly acquire.
"You've been so quiet lately," Sarah observed as they cleared the dinner dishes. "Is everything all right at work?"
"You seem like you have something heavy on your mind." James paused in his dishwashing, staring out the kitchen window at their small garden. How could he explain that he possessed knowledge that could potentially reshape the British constitutional system? How could he tell her that he was carrying secrets that belonged to kings and prime ministers, not to security guards from working-class backgrounds? "Just some complicated situations at work," he finally replied. "Nothing I can really talk about, but nothing you need to worry about either." Sarah accepted this answer, as she had many times before during their marriage. The nature of James's work had always required a certain level of confidentiality, and she had long ago learned not to press for details about palace business. But James could see the concern in her eyes, the way she continued to watch him throughout the evening. Late that night, as Sarah slept peacefully beside him, James stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of his situation. He had stumbled into possession of information that belonged in the hands of constitutional scholars, senior government officials, and religious leaders. Yet here he was, a man whose expertise lay in physical security and threat assessment, trying to understand the implications of what he had learned. The weight of the secret felt like a physical presence in his chest, making it difficult to breathe normally. He found himself wondering if this was how government officials felt when they dealt with classified information, if the burden of dangerous knowledge was always this crushing. James had always imagined that powerful people were comfortable with powerful secrets, but his recent experience was teaching him that knowledge could be its own form of torture. As he finally began to drift off to sleep near dawn, James made a resolution that would define the coming weeks. He would continue to do his job with the same professionalism and discretion that had characterized his entire career, but he would also remain vigilant for any opportunity to understand more about what was unfolding. Not out of curiosity, but out of a growing sense that his accidental knowledge might somehow become important, that his unique position might make him a crucial witness to history in the making. He had no way of knowing that within days the crisis he had witnessed would explode into public view in a way that would test not only his professional discretion, but his personal integrity as well. The explosion came on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after James had overheard the conversation between Sir Clive and the King. He was conducting his usual morning security briefing when his supervisor, Inspector Davies, burst into the room with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Emergency meeting in Conference Room A, immediately," Davies announced. "All senior protection officers, no exceptions." James followed his colleagues into the conference room, noting the unusual tension that seemed to permeate the entire security team. Inspector Davies closed the door behind them and activated the room's electronic privacy shields, a precaution usually reserved for discussions about serious security threats. "Gentlemen, we have a situation," Davies began, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately commanded attention. "At approximately 9 this morning, His Majesty made an announcement that has created what can only be described as a constitutional crisis. I'm about to brief you on information that is currently known only to senior government officials and palace staff. What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room under any circumstances." James felt his stomach drop as Davies continued. "The King has announced his intention to formally separate the Church of England from state control, effectively ending 4 centuries of unified church-state governance. He's also declared his support for full legislative recognition of same-sex marriage within Anglican ceremony, in direct opposition to current church doctrine." The room fell completely silent. James could hear his own heartbeat as the implications of Davies's words sank in. This was what Charles had been discussing with Camilla, what had prompted Sir Clive's desperate warnings about constitutional crisis. The King had followed through with his plan despite the opposition from his closest advisers. "The Prime Minister has called an emergency cabinet meeting," Davies continued. "The Archbishop of Canterbury has requested an immediate audience with His Majesty. 3 senior bishops have already indicated they may resign rather than accept state mandates on religious doctrine. The Scottish National Party is calling this an opportunity to revisit the constitutional relationship between Scotland and the Crown. And the press?" Davies paused, rubbing his forehead. "The press is in complete chaos." James found himself struggling to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. What he had witnessed as private family drama had erupted into a national crisis that could reshape the British constitutional system. The knowledge he had been carrying for a week suddenly felt like a burning secret that threatened to expose itself through his very presence in the room. Our immediate concern is security, Davies continued. Public demonstrations are already being organized on both sides of this issue. We're expecting significant crowds outside the Palace, Westminster Abbey, and Downing Street. All leave is cancelled, and we're moving to emergency protocols immediately. As the briefing continued with specific security assignments, James realized that his accidental knowledge had put him in an impossible position. He understood the background to this crisis in ways that even his superiors didn't, yet he couldn't reveal what he knew without admitting to a massive breach of royal privacy. Inspector Davies concluded the briefing by assigning specific duties to each officer. James found himself assigned to the palace perimeter, monitoring the growing crowds of protesters and supporters who were beginning to gather outside the gates. It was a routine assignment that would normally have felt straightforward, but today it carried the weight of his secret knowledge. As James took his position outside the palace, he was struck by the immediate intensity of public reaction. Within hours of the king's announcement, hundreds of people had gathered holding signs that ranged from supportive messages about religious freedom to angry demands for Charles to abdicate. The crowd was remarkably diverse. Young progressive activists stood alongside elderly traditional Anglicans, while families with children gathered near groups of university students. "This is what true leadership looks like," James heard one young woman telling a television reporter. "The king is finally bringing the monarchy into the 21st century." Just meters away, an elderly man in a clerical collar was speaking to another journalist. 400 years of tradition cannot be overturned by royal decree, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. This threatens the very foundation of our religious and constitutional order. As James monitored the crowd, he found himself thinking about the conversation he had overheard between Charles and Camilla. The Queen Consort had warned about exactly this kind of reaction, had predicted that the king's decision would split the nation and potentially damage the monarchy irreparably. Watching the passionate arguments unfolding before him, James began to understand the full weight of what Charles had chosen to do. Around midday, James noticed a commotion near the palace gates. A group of senior religious figures, including several bishops, still wearing their ceremonial robes, was approaching the entrance. James recognized the Archbishop of Canterbury among them, his face grave with the weight of the developing crisis. "Emergency clerical delegation requesting immediate audience with His Majesty," one of the bishops announced to the gate security. "This is a matter of urgent constitutional importance." James watched as the delegation was processed through security protocols and escorted into the palace. He knew that this meeting would likely determine whether the Church of England could find some way to accommodate the king's vision, or whether the religious establishment would formally break with the crown for the first time since the Protestant Reformation. His radio crackled with an update from control. "All perimeter units, be advised that we're receiving reports of larger demonstrations forming at Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's Cathedral. Additional religious groups are organizing throughout London. Maintain heightened awareness and report any signs of crowd volatility." As the afternoon progressed, James began to notice changes in the crowd dynamics. What had started as separate groups of supporters and opponents was gradually becoming more integrated, with individuals from different perspectives engaging in intense discussions. Some conversations remained civil, even friendly, but others were growing heated as the full implications of the king's decision became clearer. "He's destroying everything our ancestors died for," James heard one man arguing passionately. "The Protestant settlement, the constitutional balance, the relationship between crown and faith, it's all being thrown away for political correctness." "Maybe it needs to be thrown away," a younger woman replied. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending that a 1,000-year-old institution can govern a modern democracy without change." James found himself thinking about his own relationship with these institutions. He had never been particularly religious, but he had always respected the Church of England as part of the fabric of British society. He believed deeply in the monarchy, not as a divine institution, but as a symbol of continuity and stability. Now he was watching both institutions potentially transform in ways that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. Around 4 in the afternoon, James received an unexpected radio call. "Sergeant Mitchell, report to Inspector Davies immediately. You're being reassigned to internal palace security for the remainder of your shift." James felt a spike of anxiety as he made his way back into the palace. Internal assignments during crisis situations were usually reserved for officers with specific knowledge or expertise. He worried that somehow his accidental eavesdropping had been discovered, that he was being called in to account for his unauthorized knowledge of the situation's background. Inspector Davies met him in the same conference room where the morning briefing had taken place. The inspector looked even more exhausted than he had several hours earlier, and James noticed that his usually impeccable uniform was slightly wrinkled, suggesting he had been dealing with crisis management all day. "Mitchell, I need someone I can trust on internal monitoring duty," Davies began. "The religious delegation has been meeting with His Majesty for over 3 hours. The Queen Consort has requested a separate private meeting with the Archbishop. The Prime Minister is en route for an emergency consultation, and we're getting reports that several senior palace staff are considering resignation." James nodded, trying to appear professionally calm despite the turmoil in his thoughts. "What exactly do you need me to do, sir?" "I need you positioned outside the King's private study. Whatever happens in the coming hours, we need to ensure that the security of these meetings is absolute. No interruptions, no unauthorized access, no breaches of any kind. Can I count on your discretion and professionalism?" "Of course, sir," James replied, though internally he was wrestling with the irony of being assigned to protect the privacy of conversations that would likely parallel those he had already accidentally overheard. As James took his position outside the King's study, he could hear the low murmur of intense conversation from within. The Archbishop's voice was occasionally audible, carrying a tone of urgent concern that reminded James of Sir Clive's earlier warnings about constitutional crisis. The King's responses were less clear, but James could detect the same determined conviction that had characterized his conversation with his private secretary. After nearly an hour, the door opened and the Archbishop emerged, followed by the other religious leaders. James was struck by how defeated they looked, as though they had just witnessed the collapse of something fundamental to their understanding of the world. The Archbishop paused as he passed James, looking directly at him with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "Sergeant, I hope you understand that what we've witnessed today will be remembered for generations to come. History is being made, whether wisely or foolishly remains to be seen." James nodded respectfully, unsure how to respond to such a weighty observation from one of the most senior religious figures in the country. As the delegation departed, he found himself wondering what exactly had been discussed, what compromises might have been offered or rejected, what final positions had been established. The King appeared in his doorway shortly after, and James was again struck by how the burden of leadership seemed to have physically aged him over the past week. Charles looked directly at James, and in that moment, James had the unsettling feeling that somehow his accidental knowledge was visible, that the King could sense his understanding of the deeper background to this crisis. "Sergeant Mitchell," Charles said quietly, "today has been one of the most difficult days of my reign. I hope you understand that sometimes doing what's right requires accepting consequences that no one desires." "I understand, Your Majesty," James replied, though he wasn't entirely sure he did understand the full complexity of what Charles was facing. As evening approached, James was finally relieved of his duties and began the journey home. The drive through London revealed a city transformed by the day's events. Television crews were stationed outside major churches, political headquarters, and government buildings. Electronic billboards displayed breaking news updates about the constitutional crisis. Radio call-in shows were dominated by passionate debates about religious freedom, royal prerogatives, and the future of British institutions. At home, Sarah was waiting with a dinner that had long since grown cold, and eyes full of questions she knew she couldn't ask. The television news was providing continuous coverage of what journalists were calling the most significant constitutional crisis since the abdication. "It's been quite a day," Sarah observed carefully, watching James's face for any indication of how deeply the crisis was affecting his work.
"Yes," James replied simply, settling into his chair and trying to process everything he had witnessed.
Quite a day indeed. As they watched the news together, James realized that his accidental knowledge had given him a unique perspective on the unfolding crisis. He understood the personal cost that Charles's decision was having on his marriage, the internal conflicts that had preceded the public announcement, the warnings that had been ignored by a king determined to act according to his conscience rather than political convenience. The television showed footage of the crowds James had monitored earlier, now grown to thousands of people representing every segment of British society. Religious leaders, political activists, ordinary families, and constitutional scholars were all grappling with the implications of a decision that would reshape fundamental aspects of British governance. Later that night, as Sarah slept beside him, James reflected on his role as an accidental witness to history. He had always thought of himself as a simple working man doing his duty to protect the royal family. Now he found himself carrying secrets that belonged to the highest levels of government, knowledge that could provide crucial context to historians and journalists trying to understand the crisis. But James also understood that his duty remained unchanged, regardless of what he had learned. His oath was to protect the royal family, including protecting them from the consequences of their most private moments being exposed. The burden of his knowledge would remain his alone, a testament to the complex relationship between duty, discretion, and the accidental weight of history. As he finally drifted off to sleep, James wondered what the coming weeks would bring, how the crisis would resolve, and whether the institutions he had spent his career protecting would emerge from this turmoil strengthened or forever changed. He had become an unwitting guardian of royal secrets during the most turbulent period in modern British constitutional history, and that responsibility would define the rest of his career in ways he was only beginning to understand.